The air crackled with excitement. Graduation was days away. Years of homework, exams, and teenage drama were about to culminate in a single glorious ceremony. For CJ Griggs, it felt surreal. He was finally breaking free. He looked around at his friends, their faces glowing in the dim light of the library. Laura, his girlfriend, was beautiful as always, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. Michael, his best friend since kindergarten, was practically vibrating with excitement. James, Brandon, and Robbie, the rest of their tight-knit group, were engaged in a heated debate about their post-graduation plans. Their voices, usually loud and boisterous, were hushed in deference to the library setting, but even their whispers couldn't hide their enthusiasm. CJ smiled, soaking it all in. This was it. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Little did he know the next chapter would be far more terrifying than anything he could have ever imagined. The library, usually a sanctuary of quiet and knowledge, buzzed with a different kind of energy that afternoon. Students huddled together, whispering about their plans for the summer, their voices laced with nervous excitement. The air was thick with the scent of old books and anticipation. Sunlight streamed through the large arched windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpets and towering bookshelves. CJ and his friends had claimed their usual spot, a secluded table tucked away in a quiet corner, surrounded by towering stacks of books. It was their haven, a place where they could escape the chaos of high school and just be themselves. They had spent countless hours at that table, studying for exams, gossiping about classmates, and dreaming about the future. But today was different. Today, the weight of their impending graduation hung heavy in the air, a tangible reminder that their lives were about to change forever. A sudden buzz from CJ's phone sliced through the quiet chatter of the library, startling him. He pulled it out of his pocket, frowning. It was an emergency alert, the kind that sent a shiver down his spine.
What is it?
Laura asked, her brow furrowed with concern. CJ quickly scanned the message. His blood ran cold. Alternate, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Everyone knew what it meant. The world as they knew it was about to change. A collective gasp rippled through the library as other students received the same alert. The quiet chatter ceased abruptly, replaced by a tense silence. All eyes turned towards the large television screen mounted on the wall, usually tuned to the school's news channel. Just moments before, CJ had been lost in thought, picturing himself walking across the stage, diploma in hand. He could almost hear the roar of the crowd, the cheers of his family and friends. He had worked so hard for this moment, and now it was finally within reach. He had big dreams, plans that stretched far beyond the confines of their small town. He and Laura were going to attend the state university together, a thrilling prospect that filled him with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Michael wanted to pursue a career in music, his passion for the guitar evident in the way his fingers danced across the fretboard. James, the resident athlete, had his sights set on a sports scholarship. Brandon, the quiet one, dreamed of becoming a writer, his notebooks filled with stories that transported you to other worlds. And Robbie, the life of the party, just wanted to experience it all. They were young, full of hope and ambition, their futures stretching out before them like an unwritten novel. Now, it seemed, those dreams were about to be put on hold. The library was eerily quiet now, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of dread settling over the students like a shroud.
CJ could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked at Laura, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear.
He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a silent gesture of comfort and reassurance. They were in this together, whatever this was.
The television screen flickered to life, interrupting his thoughts. A news anchor appeared, his face grim, his voice tight with urgency.
"This is not a test," he said, his words sending a chill down CJ's spine. "I repeat, this is not a test. What followed would change their lives forever. The world was about to plunge into a nightmare." The news anchor's face was ashen, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "We are receiving reports of multiple incidents across the city," he announced, his words clipped and urgent. "Eyewitness accounts describe unusual activity." His words were vague, but CJ could hear the underlying fear in his voice. The camera panned to a chaotic scene outside what looked like a shopping mall. People were running, screaming, their faces contorted in terror. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. CJ felt a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He had never seen so much fear, so much panic in his life. The news anchor continued, his voice barely audible above the commotion in the background. "We urge everyone to remain calm and stay indoors," he pleaded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Lock your doors, stay away from windows, and await further instructions from authorities." But his words were lost in the rising tide of chaos that was about to engulf their world. The camera zoomed in on the crowd, capturing the faces of the fleeing shoppers in stark detail. And that's when CJ saw them. Emerging from the shadows, their grotesque forms twisting and contorting were the stuff of nightmares. Clowns. But not the cheerful, happy-go-lucky entertainers of birthday parties and circuses. These were monstrous parodies, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of painted-on smiles, their eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. Their movements were jerky, erratic, almost inhumanly fast. They lunged at the fleeing shoppers, their blood-stained claws tearing, ripping, shredding. The screams of the victims were cut short, replaced by the sickening crunch of bone and the wet, tearing sound of flesh being ripped apart. CJ watched in horror, his breath catching in his throat. The scene was like something out of a horror movie, too gruesome, too surreal to be real. But it was real, and it was happening right before his eyes. A collective gasp of horror filled the library as the students witnessed the carnage unfolding on the screen. The news anchor, his face now ashen, struggled to maintain his composure.
"Oh my God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. They're everywhere."
Suddenly the lights flickered, plunging the library into darkness. A wave of uneasy murmurs rippled through the room. Then silence. A heavy, expectant silence that seemed to amplify every rustle, every creak of the old building. CJ felt a cold sweat prickling at his skin. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, with an unseen energy that sent shivers down his spine. He could hear his own heart pounding in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. Beside him, Laura gasped, her hand clutching his arm in a vice-like grip.
"What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear.
CJ didn't have an answer. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew with a chilling certainty that something terrible was about to happen. A blood-curdling scream pierced the silence, echoing through the darkened library. It was followed by another and another until the air was filled with the sounds of terror. Panic erupted, students scrambling blindly in the darkness, their cries mingling with the sickening sounds of violence.
"We need to get out of here," CJ shouted, his voice barely audible above the chaos. He grabbed Laura's hand, pulling her towards him. "Come on, let's go." But the library, once a sanctuary of knowledge and quiet contemplation, had become a death trap.
Desperation lent them strength. CJ and his friends, their hearts pounding in unison, pushed their way through the panicked crowd, their eyes struggling to adjust to the dim emergency lights that flickered intermittently. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood, the metallic scent sending a wave of nausea through CJ. He could hear the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor, the gurgling gasps of the dying. The nightmare was real, and it was happening all around them. A surge of bodies slammed into CJ, knocking him off his feet. He hit the floor hard, the air knocked out of his lungs. He struggled to his knees, his eyes frantically searching for Laura in the swirling chaos.
"Laura!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "Laura, where are you?" A hand grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. It was Michael, his face pale but determined.
"CJ, we gotta go now," he yelled, his words barely audible above the screams and the sickening crunching sounds.
CJ caught a glimpse of Laura, her face contorted in terror, being swept away by the panicked mob.
"No, Laura!" he screamed, struggling to break free from Michael's grip. But Michael held on tight, his eyes pleading with CJ to understand.
"We can't help her now, CJ. We have to go."
Michael, James, Brandon, and Robbie formed a protective circle around CJ, shielding him as best they could from the surging crowd.
"We have to get to higher ground."
James shouted, his voice tight with urgency.
"The roof."
Robbie yelled back, pointing towards the emergency exit sign glowing faintly in the darkness. They pushed their way towards the exit, their progress slow and agonizing. The stairwell was a crush of bodies, students scrambling over each other in their desperation to escape the carnage. CJ felt a surge of claustrophobia, the press of bodies suffocating, the stench of sweat and fear overwhelming.
Keep moving!
Michael yelled from behind him, his voice strained with effort. They stumbled up the stairs, their lungs burning, their legs screaming for respite. But there was no time to stop, no time to rest. Their lives depended on reaching the roof. Bursting through the heavy metal door onto the rooftop, CJ sucked in a lungful of fresh air, the stench of blood and sweat less overpowering up here. The wind whipped at their faces, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the stairwell. Below, the parking lot was a maelstrom of chaos, students scattering like ants under a magnifying glass.
We made it.
James gasped, leaning heavily against the low wall that encircled the roof. His chest heaved, his breath forming white puffs in the cool night air. But there was no triumph in his voice, only exhaustion and a deep-seated fear that none of them could ignore. CJ scanned the rooftop, his eyes searching for any sign of the monstrous clowns. The roof was deserted, bathed in the eerie glow of the city lights. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the adrenaline that had fueled their escape now fading, leaving him shaky and drained. Laura, her face, contorted in terror, flashed before his eyes. He had lost sight of her in the chaos, guilt twisted in his gut. He should have held on tighter, he should have protected her. But what could he have done against that tide of madness? From their vantage point, the city unfolded before them, a panorama of terror. Fires raged in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow against the darkening sky. The air was thick with smoke and the distant, incessant wail of sirens. But it was the screams that chilled CJ to the bone. They rose from the streets below, a chorus of terror that seemed to stretch for miles. Each scream was a life being extinguished, a story cut short. The enormity of the situation crashed over CJ like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a local incident, it was a full-blown apocalypse. And they were trapped in the middle of it, with no way of knowing who to trust, where to go, or what to do. He looked at his friends, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering light from the city. Michael, usually the life of the party, stood silently, his gaze fixed on the chaos below. James, the athlete, looked as if all the strength had been drained from his body. And Robbie, the ever-optimistic one, had a haunted look in his eyes.
We can't stay here.
Michael said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was low, urgent.
They could find a way up here.
He was right. The roof offered a temporary respite, but it wouldn't be long before the clowns figured out how to reach them.
What do we do then? Where do we go?
Robbie asked, his voice tinged with panic. CJ looked at them, his mind racing. He had to think, had to come up with a plan, but his thoughts were scattered, fragmented like shards of glass. My uncle, he lives out by the lake. He always said that if anything like this ever happened, we should head there. Hope flickered in CJ's chest. It was a long shot, but it was something. James asked, doubt lacing his words. The lake house was a good 20 miles outside of the city. A 20-mile journey through streets teeming with those things. But what choice did they have? S3, media, people looking worried, group discussing in fear, anxious faces close up. Do you think we can make it? Before CJ could voice his thoughts, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the air, shattering the momentary hope that had settled over them. It came from the stairwell door, the metal door rattling violently as if something was trying to break through. Panic surged through CJ again, cold and sharp. They were trapped. He turned to warn the others, but the words died in his throat. Brandon was sprawled on the ground, writhing in pain, his hand clutching his leg. And then CJ saw it. A flash of white and red, a grotesque painted-on grin disappearing back into the stairwell. One of the clowns had gotten to Brandon, bitten him.
Brandon!
Michael shouted, rushing towards him, but CJ grabbed his arm, holding him back.
No, Michael, it's too late.
He could see the change already starting in Brandon's eyes, the light fading, replaced by a chilling, predatory gleam. Brandon's screams morphed into guttural growls, his body convulsing violently. His skin, once tanned and healthy, took on a sickly pallor, veins darkening beneath the surface like twisted, writhing worms. The painted-on smile that had seemed so grotesque on the clowns now stretched across Brandon's face, a horrifying parody of joy. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cold reptilian slits, burning with a hunger that sent shivers down CJ's spine.
He's one of them now. They all backed away, their eyes fixed on Brandon's transforming form, a mixture of grief and terror etched on their faces. They knew what they had to do, but the thought of hurting Brandon, their friend, was unbearable. Brandon lunged, his movements no longer human but those of a predator. He slammed into Michael, knocking him to the ground. This wasn't Brandon anymore. It was a monster wearing his friend's skin.
Michael cried out as Brandon's weight slammed into him. CJ reacted instinctively, launching himself at Brandon, grabbing him by the shoulders and shoving with all his might. Brandon stumbled back, momentarily dislodged from Michael.
Get up, Michael! Run! But it was too late. As Michael scrambled to his feet, Brandon lunged again, his clawed hand shooting out, catching Michael by the throat. A strangled cry escaped Michael's lips as Brandon dragged him towards the edge of the roof. CJ watched in horror, his blood turning to ice in his veins. They struggled on the precipice, the city lights blurring below. Then, with a sickening lurch, they were both gone.
A numb silence descended upon the rooftop. CJ stared at the spot where his friends had vanished, his mind refusing to process the scene that had just unfolded before his eyes.
James and Robbie stood frozen, their faces pale and streaked with tears. The wind whipped at their hair, the only sound the distant wail of sirens and the ever-present screams echoing from the city below. He felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but grief and a bone-deep terror that threatened to consume him.
He had just watched his best friend die, dragged into the abyss by another friend who was no longer himself. The world had tilted on its axis and nothing made sense anymore. CJ wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but no sound came out.
The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying with it the stench of smoke and decay. CJ shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The sun was setting, casting the rooftop in long, ominous shadows.
We have to go. For Michael. For Brandon. CJ nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They turned away from the edge of the roof, their gazes fixed on the cityscape before them. The city that had once held so much promise, so much hope, now seemed like a graveyard. And they were just three souls, adrift in a sea of madness, clinging to the faintest glimmer of hope. The wind howled around them, whispering tales of horror and despair. But somewhere, beneath the fear and the grief, a spark of determination flickered within CJ. He would survive. He would honor the memory of his friends. He had to.
The journey to the lake house was a blur of fear and adrenaline. CJ, James, and Robbie moved like ghosts through the desolate streets, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The city, once a symphony of life and sound, was now a desolate wasteland, haunted by the echoes of screams and the ever-present threat of those things.
They avoided the main roads, sticking to back alleys and deserted side streets, their eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement, their hearts pounding in their chests like war drums. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of doom.
The weight of their loss hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket of grief and guilt. Michael, Brandon. Their faces, frozen in time, haunted CJ's waking thoughts and plagued his dreams. He had failed them both. He should have been faster, stronger, smarter. But there was no time for regrets, no time for mourning. Survival in this new, terrifying world demanded constant vigilance, a ruthless suppression of emotions that threatened to overwhelm them. They had to keep moving, had to keep fighting, for as long as they had to.
They walked in silence, their footsteps the only sound in the stillness. There were no words that could adequately express the depth of their grief, the rawness of their loss.
CJ often found himself reaching out, as if to touch Michael's shoulder, to share a joke, to hear his friend's infectious laughter. But his hand would meet only empty air, the silence amplifying his loneliness.
James, usually the strong, silent type, seemed to have retreated further into himself, his gaze distant, his shoulders slumped with the weight of unspoken grief. He moved with a mechanical efficiency, his every action betraying a deep-seated pain that he kept tightly bottled up inside. Robbie, the life of the party, the one who always had a smile on his face and a joke ready on his lips, was now uncharacteristically subdued. His usual boisterous laughter was replaced by a hollow silence, his eyes reflecting the horror they had witnessed.
As they walked, CJ's mind drifted back to a simpler time, before the world had turned upside down. He remembered their laughter echoing through the halls of the high school, their shared dreams of the future, their unbreakable bond of friendship. He pictured Michael, his fingers flying across the fretboard of his guitar, lost in the music, his face shining with pure joy. He remembered Brandon, hunched over his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration as he painstakingly crafted his stories, his words painting vivid pictures in their minds. He saw James, his athletic frame gliding effortlessly across the basketball court, his competitive spirit burning bright, his determination unmatched. Those memories, once a source of comfort, now felt like shards of glass piercing his heart, a constant reminder of what he had lost and what he could never regain. Shelter and shadows. As darkness fell, they sought refuge in a dilapidated convenience store. The air inside was stale and heavy with the smell of decay.
We need to stay alert. This place might be safe for now, but who knows what's out there.
Yeah, I don't trust the quiet. It's too eerie. They huddled together, their bodies exhausted, their minds on high alert. The silence was broken only by the sound of their own breathing and distant, unsettling laughter.
Did you hear that? That laughter. It's getting closer.
Just stay calm, we can handle this.
Section 5, Scars of Survival. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, CJ, James, and Robbie pressed on, driven by a primal instinct to survive.
We've come this far. We can't give up now. The clown apocalypse had changed them, etching invisible scars on their souls.
I miss the old days when we didn't have to fight for every breath. CJ, once a carefree teenager, now carried the weight of leadership thrust upon him by tragedy.
Section 6, A Glimmer of Hope. They had encountered others along the way, survivors of the clown apocalypse, some friendly, some desperate. They had learned to be wary, to trust their instincts.
It's hard to know who to trust anymore.
We stick to ourselves. It's safer that way. But amidst the tales of horror and despair, there were glimmers of hope.
Did you hear about the resistance? They say there's a safe zone somewhere. Rumors of a resistance spread like wildfire among the dispossessed. The rumors were vague, but they were enough to keep CJ, James, and Robbie going.
Together we'll find that haven. We have to believe it's out there.
They were holed up in an abandoned church, its stained glass windows long shattered, its pews overturned and rotting. The air was thick with the smell of incense and decay, a faint echo of the sanctuary it once was.
CJ was on edge. He'd been having the dreams again, vivid nightmares of grotesque, painted faces, of Michael's pleading eyes, of Brandon's twisted smile. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that danger lurked just beyond the veil of darkness. A low, guttural chanting drifted through the broken windows, sending a shiver down his spine. It was a sound he had come to dread, a sound that heralded the arrival of the clowns.
They're here, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the chanting. James moved to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the boarded-up frame. There's a whole pack of them, he hissed, his voice tight with urgency. They're circling the church.
CJ joined him at the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see them now, a dozen or more of the creatures, their painted faces grotesque masks in the flickering light of the torches they carried. They moved with a chilling grace, their movements synchronized, their chanting growing louder, more insistent.
And then he saw her. In the center of the circle, illuminated by the flickering torchlight, stood a lone figure. Her back was to him, but he would recognize that long, dark hair anywhere. It couldn't be. It couldn't be her. After all these years.
Laura? He whispered, his voice choked with disbelief. The figure didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her head bowed as if in prayer, her body swaying slightly to the rhythm of the chanting. CJ felt a surge of hope, so powerful it threatened to overwhelm him.
We have to help her, he said, his voice firm despite the tremor that ran through him. We can't just leave her there. CJ, it's too risky. There's too many of them. We'll never make it.
But CJ was already moving, grabbing his makeshift weapon, his mind made up. They slipped out of the church through a side door, keeping to the shadows, their movements silent and swift. The chanting grew louder as they approached the clearing, the clowns' grotesque shadows dancing on the trees. CJ felt a surge of adrenaline, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. They had to time it perfectly. A distraction. That's what they needed. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, CJ nodded to James.
Takes a deep breath. Ah!
James, his face grim, let out a roar, a primal scream of rage and defiance that echoed through the night. The clowns reacted instantly, their heads snapping up, their attention drawn to the source of the sound. It was their chance. CJ, his eyes fixed on Laura, bolted from the trees, his weapon raised, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the circle, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his muscles screaming in protest. The clowns, momentarily distracted by James's diversion, turned towards him, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. But CJ had eyes only for Laura. "Laura!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. "It's me, CJ! Don't you recognize me?" The figure in the center slowly raised her head, her face emerging from the shadows, and CJ's world shattered. It was Laura, but not the Laura he remembered. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now vacant, hollow, reflecting the emptiness that had consumed her. Her skin was pale, stretched taut over her bones, a grotesque painted smile plastered on her face like a macabre mask. She tilted her head, a low, guttural growl rumbling in her chest. The chanting of the clowns swelled, filling the night with a cacophony of madness. CJ stared at her, his heart breaking, the last flicker of hope extinguished. The girl he loved was gone, swallowed whole by the abyss, her humanity devoured by the same darkness that now threatened to consume them all. A cold wave of understanding washed over CJ. This wasn't Laura. Not anymore. This was just another monster wearing a familiar face. A sob escaped his lips, a choked sound lost in the cacophony of the clowns chanting. He had come so close, only to be confronted by a loss more profound than he could have imagined.
CJ, we have to go, now! His voice was raw, laced with urgency. The clowns were closing in, their movements predatory, their laughter echoing through the night like a death knell.
Robbie was already running, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with terror. They sprinted through the trees, their lungs burning, their legs screaming for respite. But there was no time to stop, no time to rest. The laughter of the clowns pursued them, a chilling reminder of the darkness that clung to their heels. CJ glanced back over his shoulder, his heart sinking. The clowns were gaining on them, their grotesque forms silhouetted against the moonlit sky, their laughter growing louder with each passing moment. And in their midst, he could see her, Laura, her head thrown back, her laughter echoing through the night, a chilling counterpoint to the symphony of horror that surrounded them. They ran until they could run no more, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor, their bodies racked with exhaustion, their minds teetering on the edge of madness. The silence, when it finally came, was deafening. The only sounds were the pounding of their hearts and the rasp of their breath in the stillness of the night. CJ lay there, staring up at the sliver of moon peeking through the canopy of leaves, his mind numb with grief and exhaustion. The events of the night replayed in his mind, a macabre film reel of horror and loss. He had lost everything. His friends, his girlfriend, his hope. The world had become a twisted, nightmarish reflection of its former self, a carnival of horrors with no escape in sight.
James placed a hand on CJ's shoulder, his touch a rare gesture of comfort in a world devoid of solace. "We'll make it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. But the words rang hollow even to his own ears. What was there to live for in a world consumed by madness?
They pressed on, driven by a primal instinct to survive, even as the world crumbled around them. They became shadows, flitting from one desolate landscape to the next, their laughter silenced, their dreams replaced by nightmares. The years blurred into an endless cycle of fear and despair. They encountered other survivors, but the trauma they carried was a heavy weight, a barrier to genuine connection. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. The clowns were everywhere, their laughter a constant reminder of the chaos that reigned. They were a force of nature, unpredictable, relentless, their painted smiles a grotesque mockery of the joy that had been stolen from the world. CJ never forgot Laura. Her memory, both a blessing and a curse, haunted his waking thoughts and fueled his nightmares. He clung to the hope that somewhere, beneath the twisted facade, a flicker of the girl he once loved still remained. But deep down, he knew the truth. The world had changed, and some wounds, he realized, never truly healed.